we have some new comments from Noam Chomsky, who, of course, many people respect and admire. He gave a new interview to the New Statesman. He covered a range of issues, climate crisis, Trump, how he sees this moment right now as one of the most dangerous moments in history because you have all of these forces coming together. But we wanted to talk a little bit about his comments on Ukraine, which I thought were really interesting. Let's go ahead and put this tear sheet up on the screen. And I'm just going to read you his whole quote here. He's asked about what's going on in Ukraine, and he says, it's monstrous for Ukraine, but why did he do it, he being Putin? There are two ways of looking at this question. One way, the fashionable way in the West, is to plumb the recesses of Putin's twisted mind to try to determine what's happening in his deep psyche. The other way would be to look at the facts. For example, that in September 2021, the United States came out with a strong policy statement calling for enhanced military cooperation with Ukraine. Further, sending of advanced military weapons, all part of the enhancement program of Ukraine joining NATO. You can take your choice. We don't know which is right. What we do know is that Ukraine will be further devastated, and we may move on to terminal nuclear war if we do not pursue the opportunities that exist for a negotiated settlement. So there's a lot that's noteworthy there. First of all, I think he's completely right that there is a lot more comfort in the West with sort of like Putin psychoanalyzing than actual clear-headed thought about how we ended up in this place. And I think it's very important, too, he does not deny the monstrosity of what Putin and his cronies are doing in Ukraine. So this isn't to take away agency or say, oh, it's all the West's fault or anything like that. But it's very important that you understand how we got here. If, number one, you don't want to repeat those mistakes, and if, number two, you want to actually bring this conflict to a close. And then the other part that he says here, which should not be controversial, but is very controversial, is that he says we may move on to terminal nuclear war if we do not pursue the opportunities that exist for a negotiated settlement. That's the voice that you are not hearing anywhere from the U.S. press.
I think the thing is with Chomsky is he's literally so old is that he remembers what the last time that this was like. And that's actually important.
Like
and
he was actually alive for
he was
it and
literally
remembers.
alive.
Yeah.
Well, he was a grown adult during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is somebody who actually lived through the pre-New START era. I mean, that is just something that I think sears onto your consciousness, which we have just lost today. I've been thinking a lot about this. In graduate school, we read this great paper called The Nuclear Taboo. It was written by a woman named Nina Tannenwald, and I just looked it up. What she talked about is that over the course of 50 years, from Hiroshima up until when she wrote it, I think it was like in the 90s, that the development of the nuclear taboo was not a foregone conclusion. There were a lot of times, and I talked about it here, in the 1950s, where President Eisenhower was presented plans to use limited, again, a joke, limited nuclear weapons at Dien Bien Phu in order to defend the French, at the Suez Canal in order to save the British and the French. Sensing a theme here in terms of that. Henry Kissinger and others talked about the possible use of tactical, again, in quotes, nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Yeah. There was a long history of talking and presenting the option of nuclear weapons that really started to turn the tide after the nuclear crisis of the Cuban Missile one, because it was then when the world was faced with the actual destruction. And also people forget, the Soviets tested a bomb. It was called Tsar Bomba, and it horrified the world in terms of what an actual, I think, I'm forgetting the actual term for the type of thermonuclear explosion. It was like 56 megatons or something like that. And when it was observed with human eyes, the mushroom cloud, and exactly what it looked like, and the level of destruction and the glass that it literally turned the soil, people were like, oh my God, this is what these weapons actually look like. But the thing is, it's been 60, 70 years since that happened. And so only people like him who are 90-something years old were old enough to remember. And now we're slow walking ourselves into all these debates that we had already.
Although it's interesting because actually, typically, if you look at the polling, the older you are, the more hawkish your views on this.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Yeah, I don't know.
And so I think there's also a cable news effect, frankly, of, you know, older Americans are much more likely to be consuming Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. I mean, their average age is like 66, 67 in terms of their average viewer. And so they're just relentlessly taking in this, we got to do more, we got to do more, we got to do more propaganda. Now, even among those groups, when you say, well, what if we actually put boots on the ground? They're like, hell no. But everything up to that, even things that would very clearly lead to that, because the media has done such a poor job of explaining and educating and instead only does like human interest stories. Again, nothing against human interest stories, but that can't be the entirety of what you're doing on this conflict. You've really got to understand and explain what is going on and what the potential geopolitical implications are. Because that's been their direction, you have this very hawkish instinct among older generations who are also still very steeped in this like Cold War, it's us against the Soviet Union kind of a mentality. I mean, these are the people who still think that Russia is communist, even though it's like completely absurd. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to look at this more like how Noam Chomsky looks at it and to be really committed to how do we get to peace? How do we make sure that we don't end up in this situation? How do we evaluate honestly what the US's role was in leading us to the brink of war, again, not taking any of the agency for the actual invasion from Putin.
It's a good point. And actually, now that I think about it, it might make sense that many of the boomers who did this were either not alive or children during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And instead, their memory is of Ronald Reagan bringing back rollback into containment policy of the US versus the Soviet Union and winning the Cold War. So they're probably much more triumphalist in what it might look like. However, they forget what the precarious days when there was actual nuclear parity between the US and the Soviets actually looked like. So maybe it's only the septuagenarians that are old enough.
Maybe if we just had like the 90-year-old cohort and the 80-year-old cohort, because Bernie's pretty good on this too.
Yeah,
so
that's
maybe
true.
There's something to that.
I'm not going to defend septuagenarian leadership, but perhaps there is a small, slight advantage to that because they're old enough in order to remember. All I would say is that when I see renewed calls and the disregard of risk, it just seems that we've forgotten so much history. And the people who lived through these great wars, World War I and World War II, they never forgot what they saw. Same with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was imprinted on their consciousness until the day that they died. And I think that the misfortune is that we haven't had a population or even a leadership that has that, to the extent that younger people like us who are very against war and are much more minded to restraint, it's because all we have watched are utter failures in our lifetime. I was a child when the US invaded Iraq. I watched Afghanistan, watched Libya, watched Syria. What confidence do I have in the ability of the United States?
Well, that's true. I mean, our formative experiences being Iraq is very, that'll leave an impact for sure. I also think that older generations, and this is like very typical, are more susceptible to propaganda because, as sort of like new means of propaganda are developed, new generations become sort of more savvy to them. I mean, I think of my dad, who is extremely brilliant person. He's a PhD physicist, and he would get these chain emails during the Obama era that he would like sort of take seriously, because you just haven't built up. If you're of an older generation, you came of age at a time when that sort of just like outright lies and propaganda wasn't something you had to inoculate yourself against. So I also think that the younger you are, the more questioning you are of the information that you're being fed, the less that you're reliant just on the New York Times and CNN or Fox News for your information diet. And so the more open you'll be to seeing things through a different lens than what the entire mainstream establishment media is presenting you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you look at it all together, and it's a scary situation, but I'm glad that Chomsky could warn us all, at least in this instance.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing, and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.